Hello? Can you hear me okay? All right, welcome everybody. Hope you've had a good morning. I'm the last person to speak before lunch, which of course means that you're the hungriest and the tiredest that you're going to be until the end of today, so I got the worst shift. But let's see if we can just finish off with a nice positive note or talk about something maybe a little bit different. So I wanted to just start off by saying it's been a heck of a crazy year for us in crypto, hasn't it? What with the FTX crash and all these wonderful pieces of news that come through. I don't need to tell anybody in the industry about the consequences of things like this. We have to read it, we have to hear it over and over again. The mainstream media does what it usually does, and every time one of these crises hits, declares that this time for real, it's the end of crypto. We're done. And we roll our eyes and shake our heads because we hear this every single time that something like this happens. It's just on repeat. But that's the point, isn't it? Every time. When I say every time something like this happens, I have a chance to go somewhere and give a speech that begins with a phrase just like the one I started this speech with. Well, it's been a crazy week for crypto. It's been a crazy month for crypto. It's been a crazy year for crypto. Any industry and any technology can have its volatile moments, but at some point we have to accept, perhaps as an industry, that this is not quite normal. And I think, or certainly is one of the things that I talk about when I go to events, is that it's time to bring some normality into the industry. And this kind of normalcy begins with things like government regulation, that big word that many of us don't like to hear. But of course the problem is that while the passing of any regulation could help to benefit us in the industry, it also helps to reduce the freedom that we have to operate in the space, which itself threatens the very privacy that we hold clear in this industry. So we find ourselves caught between a rock and a hard place in that we both need regulation as an industry, but we want to maintain this freedom and this privacy that we've fought so hard. So I want to first just talk a little bit about some reasons why we might as an industry want to welcome a little bit more regulation into the space. And, sorry, if I can just go. Okay, great. So, most relevant to how I begun and most relevant to this picture behind me, which is from the Wild West, I think it's way past the time that we separate ourselves from the cowboys in the industry. I'd like to think that everybody here is working on something legitimate, something that makes a difference, whether you're cheering people up with cool games or helping them to achieve financial freedom, place their medical records on the blockchain to help with diagnosis and sharing of information. I like to think that everybody here is trying to change the world, or at least trying to change somebody's world using Web3. But disasters, the things we read in the media like FTX, let's be clear, this wasn't a failure of Web3. This was a failure of bad people doing bad things. If these same people had been doing business in the 2000s, I think they would have been selling junk mortgages. If these people had been doing business in the 1990s, they'd have been selling timeshare. They care only about money. They don't care about our industry. But unfortunately, of course, this can be taken by the general public and the media as these people being representatives of our industry, which is bad for us as a whole. They leave a trail of destruction in their wake. We see lost funds, and we see people talking about how, as an industry, the only way to prevent this from happening is that we're too opaque, so we need to be more transparent. Transparency can be good, but it can also go too far in the opposite direction. But proper regulations, when applied correctly, can help us to preemptively solve this problem by keeping these kind of negative actors and bad people out of the space, to avoid the reputational damage and the headaches that we all suffer when something like this happens. A second reason why we might want to welcome some regulation into the space is that proper, well-thought-out, structured rules will help us to avoid the legislative knee-jerk reactions that comes from governments when things like this happen. So, to give you an example, what tends to happen, of course, especially in places like Europe, where governments are representatives of the people, they always have to keep their eye on the next election, they have to keep their eye on public opinion polls, and so it's very important in their minds that they're seen to be doing something, but pay very attention to that word, seen to be doing something. They don't necessarily have to do the right thing, they just have to look like they're doing something. So to give you an example of how this operates in real life, when the FTX crash happened last year, around the same time, the Czech delegation, which was leading the presidency of the European Union at the time, was helping to negotiate the next draft of the anti-money laundering bill, and they were also working on some early drafts of the markets and crypto assets regulations. And they came out seemingly from nowhere and said, what we have to do is we have to issue a complete and total ban on privacy coins. What does privacy coins have to do with FTX? Nothing, right? But they knew very well that most people reading about this would just see words like crypto legislation, crypto ban, and would mostly be happy that the government was doing something about it. And this is something that is very risky for us as an industry. Governments that don't understand this technology, supported by a public that doesn't understand this technology, sometimes support just a lashing out and a hitting down of whatever they can reach, which is very, very dangerous for us. So we can see that this creates a very dangerous regulatory environment for us to be operating in. And in this case, something like privacy coins is something that I think the vast majority of us hold very dear. And we don't want to see things like this risked and threatened. The third reason we might want to see more regulation in this space is that the crypto world increasingly needs to be able to interact with the non-crypto world. Now, we're very passionate, often many of us, about the idea of a crypto-native industry where everything operates within the space, where we have all the services that we need and that everything is sustainable and can last over time. But for the moment, a completely segregated crypto economy that at the same time is able to continue developing and continue to grow remains a little bit of a pipe dream. The implications of this are clear if we want to be able to move our industry forward, if we need to be able to promote the use of Web3 to people that are not currently using it. We need to be able to bring in investments from people who are not currently investing in Web3. We need to be able to persuade governments potentially to allow its use or maybe even promote its use. This means we need to be able to reach out to people that are beyond the current space. But all of these spaces that I've described, whether it's finance or government or media or anything else, are highly, highly, highly regulated. They do not and they cannot interact well with 100% anonymity. This is a reality for them. So in order to stand the chance of building bridges to this space, we will also to some extent have to be regulated too. And we have to find a balance between this regulation that we need and the potential for exposing all of our private information, which obviously not only we don't want, but we're actually fighting very hard to avoid. A fourth reason we might be interested to see more regulation in the space is that, simply speaking, I believe our priorities are different these days to what they were when it first started. When any new technology is created and begins to be used, it's of course unregulated. The government doesn't understand it, they don't know how to write rules about it. This is a normal thing. This creates a very nice natural case where, because of the lack of regulation, innovators and entrepreneurs like all of you are able to experiment with new techniques, new business methods, new business ideas, without having to worry about things like compliance, which brings with it huge costs and limitations on what you can do. This is fantastic. This is true of any new technology that's come, not just ours. However, what eventually happens is that, as I say, we start to move to a position where we have new priorities, new things that we care about. We need partners in the non-Web3 world, we need investment from outside of the Web3 space, and we need a whole bunch of users, the next billion, the next 2 billion, who are currently not familiar with the technology. And most of all, we need respect from the general public for what it is that we're trying to achieve. Regulation helps to make partnerships, investments, and usage by people outside of our space safer, and permits and promotes all of these things. It won't stop innovation, but should help us to move on to the next stage of our industry's development, or at least I hope so. I think finally welcoming regulation into the space is also a sense of maturity as well. So just like us in our real life, we early on we can be quite rebellious. We can think that rules are dumb and regulation is dumb and it's better to be outside of the space and to throw stones at it. But as we get older and mature and we grow, we learn that actually sometimes it's better to be inside the room and inside the space and help to change things from there rather than standing outside. Certainly because if nothing else, it allows you to be listened to. You have a voice. You're part of it. So as we begin to mature, this is also a change that we would like to see. Now, you may wonder why I've got this random image of a stagecoach here. When I've given talks like this at conferences in the past, I'm quite liking using this metaphor of the Wild West, the frontier. We've all heard the crypto space described as the Wild West before. I don't think it's a ridiculous metaphor to be used. I'm a bit of a history nerd and a history buff myself, so I enjoy when you can relate something back to areas that I've read a lot about. The Wild West is very interesting for me. I like to use this metaphor. This is the period of American expansion, most of you will know, where the United States started to grow into this vast wilderness and start to develop into the country that they are today. Now, when American settlers began to move out west, there was abundant opportunity as far as the eye can see. There were fortunes to be made under the ground with mining and fortunes to be made over the ground by building, kind of like us. People flooded westwards from eastern cities for the opportunity, not just to make money, but because they wanted to try new things, like us. New types of business, new forms of social hierarchy, and new ways of organizing society, just like us. But it took civilization and structured society some time to catch up, to move out and impose the rules and the systems that they were used to in the places where they came from. So as such, it was a wild place, hence the nickname of the Wild West. But over time, things changed. Frontier people wanted to be able to operate out west safely, not under the risk of these cowboys and bandits, not attracting the attention that brought. They wanted to reduce the knee-jerk reaction of the federal government that would send in troops in order to try and calm things down when it got a little bit too crazy. They needed to be able to tempt capital to move from eastern cities into the western areas because they needed to move into more capital-intensive stages of development, and they needed funds in order to do that. They had new priorities around building respectable companies and raising families, and overall the frontier community as a whole had matured and wanted to move on to its next stage of development. This is why I like this metaphor. They wanted to settle down properly and build in peace, kind of in a way like we do. But as I mentioned, any set of regulations ends up potentially restricting the freedom of the space in which we operate and threatens privacy. In Europe, where our company, Dusk Network, is based, we're on the brink of passing the Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation, or MiCA. Now, this solves many of the issues that I've mentioned earlier on in this talk. And for us, as a company whose focus is to tokenize real-world assets, this is great news. The finance industry, the traditional finance industry, is heavily regulated. And so in order to deal with us, they need to know that they can be free from risk. With something like MiCA and other regulations covering them, then they're safe to operate with us. And so for us as a company, this is fantastic. But it's not all bright and sunny. There remains some unclear connections between regulations like MiCA and data protection regulations like GDPR. There are proposals for what's called a smart contract kill switch, which obviously has horrific implications for the industry. And we still don't really know what's going on with privacy coins. There's still the potential for a full and formal ban across the entire EU, which would obviously risk every single thing that we do as an industry. So we can't pretend that regulation is all fun and games. There are obviously potential dangerous consequences of it going too far in the opposite direction. So I hope that maybe with these few words, and I won't go on too long because like I said, I know everybody's very keen for lunch. But I hope that I've made a convincing case, not just for lunch, but also that regulation in the Web3 industry is something that we should not only accept as inevitable, but maybe welcome as something that we would like to see. However, the ongoing process in Europe, which is still far from finished yet, shows that this delicate balance between regulation and privacy is a very fine one, and one that we need to keep an eye on. So what kind of message could we offer for Turkish people as they look to develop their own industry? I think what I would say is that European regulations, generally speaking, are a step in the right direction, but they've suffered a little bit from maybe not having quite enough interaction with the people which it bothers, people like us. the builders, the entrepreneurs, and the companies in the space. They really needed to talk to us a little bit more, survey us a bit more, get our understanding and our expertise of how this technology works, so they could then understand how these regulations would apply, instead of spending so much time talking to the finance industry, which seems to be a large part of what the European Commission has done. So I think my piece of advice that I would recommend to our Turkish friends here is that now more than ever is the time to engage the regulators in your own country and begin having these conversations. The risks of getting regulation wrong are obviously very terrible and very bad, but the benefits of getting it right, as I hope to have made a case for today, are potentially very real. So the time to have these conversations is now. Maybe I can let you go there, but if anybody would like to talk about that a little bit more, feel free to connect with me on Telegram or anywhere else using this QR code, and I'll see you around the conference the rest of the day. Please enjoy your lunch.
Are there any questions for Ryan?